Christians are coming to terms with the need to use political power, but what is the right range of that power? This week I read from Dustin Messer of King's College, "To the glory of God and for the good of our neighbors, Christians must pursue and use political power." But I don't see a statement from Messer on what the principle is, limiting the scope and defining the scope. Is it just use power for good? That's the kind of thing that every tyrant has always appealed to. From a more politically conservative Christian commentator, one that I know is opposed to socialism, we have Allie Beth Stuckey writing, "People freak out when someone says that Republicans should use their power to push good and punish bad." Now here she's talking about some things where I agree with her about what the Republicans or what conservatives should do. But what I see missing from the discussion is a presentation of the principles. And that's what I want, is not just the government should do good. I want to know how. So she raises a good point, but what is the role of the government? How far should its power go? What are its limits? Can those limits be named in a principled way? If we don't name them, then we have people that are in the new national conservative movement who are going to come in and they're just going to steamroll over people like Allie Beth Stuckey or Ben Shapiro even. They're going to push for a socially conservative agenda, legislating, but they're going to say free market principles don't have much of a place in this movement. They're not a defining issue in our movement. There is this push within conservative thought today to upplay the concerns of social conservatism. You can see that in the debate that goes on between, say, David French and Yoram Hazony and several other people that have criticized David French. Yoram Hazony is a key leader in a movement that calls itself national conservatism. And this is seeking to situate individual property rights as only one value among many, all of which need to be balanced against each other. In other words, not upheld as absolutes, but merely as optional preferences held on the basis of what has worked for our tribe over time, historically, generally in the path of our traditions as a people. But we don't judge other nations as, say, having worse laws than ours. We just say that our laws are the way we are. That's what we see from him. We see this approach in many different movements that are arising on the right now in response to the insanity of the radical left. They don't necessarily want to position their political platform in terms of individual rights, but rather just in terms of what is good for the nation. Good by what standard? That's the concern. We don't have a standard. We don't have a principled statement of a standard. So contrast those unprincipled approaches with the thought of Ayn Rand, and we find a whole different set of answers to the questions about liberty and about political power. Welcome to week 32 of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibolt, and we are studying the second half of Chapter 11 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. This week we are looking at pages 395 to 412. The section headings are Capitalism as the System of Objectivity, Opposition to Capitalism as Dependent on Bad Epistemology. Leonard Peikoff is answering objections and confusions about capitalism, about the free market viewpoint, about the individual property rights viewpoint. And we're in the economic areas now, so we're not simply talking about rights, but we're talking about how it plays out in laws and economics. Compared to most other sections in the book, this section is going to be fairly dense with different kinds of issues, different kinds of points coming into play. This is going to have to be Peikoff at his most concise, because there's many questions, many topics arise. So for elaborations, if you're not sure why he believes what he thinks, you can see more of Ayn Rand's work, especially see Atlas Shrugged, see The Virtue of Selfishness. Her other book that is mostly on this topic is Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. She also has several other extended Q&A or essay collections, and those also deal with economic topics or social current events type topics. So you can see The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution. That's one title. And then you can see another one called The Voice of Reason. There's also a book by Don Watkins and Yaron Brook summarizing Rand's thought on this issue, and it's called The Free Market Revolution. I highly recommend reading that. Now, as far as what we can offer you at ChristianIntellectual.com, on political theory, there are two main things I'd recommend. And that is go to the Americanism Book Study, ChristianIntellectual.com/Americanism. Or go to YouTube, just say /YouTube. Find our playlist on political theory. That's going to give you our current best resources. So let's go into the book. We are on page 395, Capitalism as the System of Objectivity. So here he will be contrasting the objectivist approach, the epistemology behind objectivism, and that approach versus intrinsicism and versus subjectivism. He writes, in essence, virtue and objectivity denote the same phenomenon. Virtue, an ethical category, objectivity, an epistemological category, right? So he's speaking of virtue and objectivity. And he says they are about the same thing, the proper volitional relationship between consciousness and existence. I know that's wordy, but he's saying using your free will, using your mind, setting your mind in a relationship to your observations. Virtue denotes this relationship considered as the principle governing a man's actions. Objectivity denotes it as a principle governing his cognition. So these are just two perspectives almost on the same thing. If you go just a paragraph right before that, he says capitalism implements the right code of morality because it is based on the right view of metaphysics and epistemology. It is the system of virtue because it is the system of objectivity. So notice how he's relating all these things. This is foundational to understanding how objectivism sees its own political thought and compares it to the political thought of other systems. Objectivism sees itself as the political theory based on a rational virtue and a rational approach to knowledge as such. Keep in mind, you cannot have a political theory unless you have an approach to virtue and an approach to knowledge as such. Every political theology, philosophy, every political ideology and system has some kind of epistemology in its assumptions and some kind of ethics in its assumptions. It's just a question of how self-aware they are and about whether those are true or false. So if we go to page 396, we read, such a system is geared to the requirements of a reality-oriented consciousness. So before we get into any other questions about what Rand's political theory does, keep in mind that their goal is to get their political philosophy geared to the requirements of a reality-oriented consciousness, because that's how they view man. That's what man is. So they write, because it is geared to the reality orientation, capitalism is incompatible with any version of subjectivism, whether personal or social, nor does, quote, laissez-faire mean anything goes. In a republic, nothing goes that infringes man's rights. People may criticize the approach to liberty that you hear on the objectivist political theory. The criticism may be, well, yeah, you say you believe in liberty, but doesn't that lead to, say, my 10-year-old walking to the store and buying alcohol or something like that? And this is a common criticism that you hear people on the new right or the dissident right toward the more libertarian thinkers or the more constitutionally conservative thinkers. And they'll say, oh, you just believe in liberty at the expense of everything else. We're going to have societal collapse. And David French's own errors on that issue are usually held up as the punching bag, because David French once said that Drag Queen Story Hour was, quote, one of the blessings of liberty. And he did it tongue-in-cheek, but nobody would say that, if you have any common sense at all. It's not a blessing, and it's not actually part of the system of liberty. By definition, this idea of drag queen story hours and all these other doctrines that we see coming up in the New Left, they are not part of what we accept as people that believe in individual rights. It's not part of the society that we envision. If you read what Allie Beth Stuckey was saying on that topic, she says Republicans should absolutely use their power to put doctors who mutilate kids in prison. That's righteous governance, and I'll take it over libertarianism any day. Well, it's just like, excuse me, there are many libertarians that would also follow your exact same policies on those topics. It's a confusion to be slighting the libertarian view like that. That's how people are thinking on the new right now. Compare that with the system that we see within Rand's view. In a republic, nothing goes that infringes man's rights. So what are the rights of, like, for example, children have rights and they have special rights. They have rights to not be exposed to certain things. That's part of protecting them as they're not yet adults. So we go on, the principle of objectivity applies to every feature of capitalism. And he's going to discuss the economic features of capitalism in particular here. Set aside this whole discussion about the new right, the national conservatives, the dissident right, and all those guys. Let's talk about the economic policies that objectivism advocates. The principle of objectivity applies to every feature of capitalism. So he's going to say the economic value of goods and services is their price. This is important. Men create products and offer them for sale. This is supply. Other men offer their own products in exchange. This is demand. Supply and demand, therefore, are two perspectives on a single fact. A man's supply is his demand. It is his only means of demanding another man's supply. He writes, the market price of a product is determined by the conjunction of two evaluations. So here he is explaining why prices and value in a free market are objective. And by objective, this is what we mean. It is what two different people can voluntarily agree to as far as what value is. He writes, the market price is based not on arbitrary wishes, but on a definite mechanism. It is at once the highest price sellers can command and the lowest price that buyers can find. And economic value thus determined is objective. In the next page, we're going to discuss what is objective value. And we have to get the theory of value here, the theory of how money works and how trade should work. And then we'll get into more narrow questions, challenges to this view. An objective value is a product as evaluated by a volitional consciousness pursuing a certain purpose in a certain cognitive context. The evaluation, including the purpose, must be rational, determined ultimately by the facts of reality. This is a definitional statement. It's a little high on the word count, but when he speaks of an objective value, What he means is that it is an individual person has evaluated something as being a value to his own life. He doesn't believe in calling, say, like a crate of apples a value if it's just in the middle of nowhere, not being used, not being chosen by an individual person. He writes, the above describes precisely how economic evaluations are made in a free market. Men are left free to judge the worth of various products in accordance with their own needs and goals. That's the objective approach to value. Market value, Peikoff writes, thus entails a valuer, purpose, beneficiary, choice, knowledge, all the insignia of objective value, as against the divine boon theory, the revealed variety. If somebody were to say, well, gold is just intrinsically this much, the price of firewood is always going to be 1 ounce of gold, and you're just going to tie them together. That would be the intrinsic theory. Ayn Rand gives a distinction, and this is somewhat important to understand her theory of value. She says that there is the philosophically objective value of a good or a service, and then there's the socially objective value of it. So we have philosophically objective, socially objective. This is just a terminological thing you have to understand to get what she's saying. If you had an airplane, philosophically, the best minds in the world looking at an airplane and looking at a bike would say the airplane is of greater value to mankind. On the individual level, say one person who doesn't have all that much money, for them, being able to buy a plane ticket is not as much of a value as owning a bike. Value is, it pertains to what is in the world, but also it pertains to the choices of the individual and their own context. And so she wants to distinguish that. And it may be that in a society, the amount of people that want to buy bikes is more than the people that want to buy airplane tickets. And if that's the case, we could say that there is a socially objective value that is placed on the bike, and it is greater at a certain time for a certain context. It's greater than the value that those people are placing on, say, an airplane. That's how she uses those two terms. Rand would write, the free market value of goods and services did not necessarily represent their philosophically objective value. Now think about why that has to be. Well, let's say there was a new creation, and say someone invents the iPhone, but nobody's ever seen an advertisement for it. They don't know what it is. What price can that command when it's a brand new product and nobody knows what it's for or whether it's good? The price that it can command is not high until the person that's selling it educates his market about its value. And sometimes for a new invention to be accepted in the market, it takes a long time. It can be that it's a period of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years before something that is good becomes accepted by the market and valued at the point that it actually should be valued. So Rand accounts for that. At any given point, what something is selling for, that would be its socially objective value. That is the combined decisions of all of the individual actors in the market. That's different from its philosophically objective value. Peikoff writes, the free market is the greatest of all educators. It continually raises the knowledge of its citizens, the caliber of their tastes, the discrimination of their pleasures, the sophistication of their needs. And then this is a quote from Rand, while the majority have barely assimilated the value of the automobile, the creative minority introduces the airplane. The majority learn by demonstration, the minority is free to demonstrate. This is how things work in a free market. Top of page 399, the system thus institutionalizes, though it cannot compel, respect for reality, and men's economic and other evaluations are set accordingly. Peikoff writes, market value in essence is the most rational assessment of a product that a free society can reach at a given time. There is always a tendency for this assessment to approach the product's philosophically objective value as people gain the requisite knowledge. Okay, so notice how they are discussing, in plain sense terms, how society values the various products that are available. Contrast this with what you see coming from the new right today. Contrast it with what you see coming from the dissident right. Those who show that one famous picture of a street that goes through a town somewhere in the mountains, and from a certain angle, you can see like a giant sign for McDonald's and a giant sign for this and that restaurant. And they say, oh, this is what capitalism brought us, and it's ugly. They just use that as a meme to sort of say, we don't like the world as it is under capitalism. Now, is the world that we see today really the world as it is under capitalism? No. And also, is the world really that bad? On the objectivist understanding of how society works, any snapshot that you take of a city at a given time, with whatever companies there are at that time, that is a snapshot of people learning what is most philosophically valuable. The process that people use to learn that is the process of people building companies, making their offers, doing what is economically possible over time. The snapshot only reveals a process. And that process is toward progress when there's a free market. If you don't have a free market, then we're not even comparing apples to apples, are we? The products that we see today, what is popular today, say like Walmart, McDonald's, those things that kind of have a bad reputation today for being just not the highest value or not the most ethical business models. That is what has come in a system that is not even free market capitalism. You see the critics are always going to rail on free market capitalism for things that it didn't do, and they're going to ignore the aspect of what we see in the world that actually did come from free choices. It's a completely perverted way of making evaluations. I agree with Rand. The market value is the most rational assessment of a product that a free society can reach at a given time. And that's important, at a given time. Let's go down to the bottom of that, page 399, and we will read some objections and comments. The bottom of 399, the dominant view today is that economic value, like every other kind, is not objective but arbitrary. Monopolists and other, quote, exploiters charge any amount they feel like charging. That's one of the kinds of criticisms that Peikoff wants to answer here. Is it really true that prices are arbitrary? Top of the next page, the standard cure for capitalism's, quote, arbitrary prices is recourse to the state. The government, we are told, must legislate an inherently fair price, independent of market conditions. And so he says that's intrinsicism, and it's posing as subjectivism. Fairness in an economic context means honest free trade. Fair price is the price that men agree to pay. So if you say that fair price is what the government says, it's just arbitrary fiat. Now, at the bottom of this page, he writes, since economic value under capitalism is objective, profits are objective. This is a criticism that we hear against capitalism from the Marxists. We hear this criticism raised by the dissident right. The wealthy businessmen are just seeking profits, and they're doing it at the expense of other people. Profit is objective. Profit is the difference between two prices, the price of the input, which includes labor, to a business, and the price of its output. There is, therefore, no such thing as an intrinsically fair profit. There is no such thing as an excess or arbitrary profit. There is only the profit that men earn. If it happened on a system of free enterprise, where people deal with each other by contract and by consent, the profit that came is the profit that was earned, by definition, excluding cases of fraud. So under capitalism, in general, material goods and services in every category are evaluated objectively. In general, their creators' long-range financial compensation is equally objective. This is a quote from Rand. The degree of man's productiveness is the degree of his reward under capitalism. That is how they view how capitalism works, how it has worked to the extent that there has been capitalism. A man's wealth under capitalism, writes Peikoff, depends on two factors, on his own creative achievement and on the choice of others to recognize it. Since the system promotes such recognition, however, a man's wealth depends, in the end, only on his exercise of his creative faculty. It's possible that you could create a really great product and nobody would understand how great it was. But long-term, under capitalism in general, that's not going to be the norm. Long-term, people are going to eventually realize and recognize the value because there's an incentive for them to do so. Okay, we're now in the middle of page 401, and I'm going to catch up on the comments. We have a couple of comments, and they probably get more into objections and things like that. So I'm going to read through them and see which ones I want to bring up. Greg has raised the question of food safety. That's something that we did discuss in the previous video, Greg. The FDA serves a needed function, but there are ways to do it without it being the government in charge of that function. So that's how we would approach that. There's more material on that within the Objectivists. I think that it's in Capitalism. The Unknown Ideal is the best place to find it. Unregulated dangerous products, that question. I think one of the biggest polemical points that you could just raise on that topic of regulations for safety is just recognize that the Titanic met safety regulations that were given by the government. One of the reasons why they didn't have sufficient lifeboats is because when the government gives you, regulation that says you must have this much, typically the engineers and companies will only go to that level. They'll meet the minimum requirements because they know that they're not going to be held accountable for anything beyond that because they met their legal requirements. This is just a thought experiment, which is actually historically true, but it's a thought experiment. And you could take that same logic, apply it to the way food is regulated. The incentives for a company to keep its food pure and to keep it safe are changed once there is a government oversight on it. And that doesn't necessarily have an upward pressure on the quality. We can get more into that in the future. We did get some interaction there with Jennifer saying that food producers wouldn't want their products making people sick. And I agree with her on that. You have to think in terms of long-term businesses. A business has its own reputation. Say like a business like Johnson & Johnson, Kraft Foods. These companies have existed for a long time, and one of the biggest components of that company's valuation is its reputation. They have an interest in maintaining it. This is from Greg. He says, another common objection, rent is going through the roof in many places, and that's unfair to the poor. So We could also agree that rent probably is more than it ought to be relative to other prices right now. Rent and also purchasing homes. I would look to Thomas Sowell for arguments about why that is. Typically, rent controls are a significant pressure on housing. And also the kind of regulations that we have on zoning and on building houses make it very difficult to profitably create new houses. There's all kinds of economic factors that go into why we have a shortage of housing and high prices on housing. To explain why that is and how a free market system would not make these problems, but the mixed economy did lead to those problems, that's beyond what I'm able to do extemporaneously. But definitely look in Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics because he addresses it adequately. So Peikoff writes, money is an objective measure of reward, and it's a reward of objective behavior. For Ayn Rand, the love of money is not the root of evil. This is interesting. They're going to talk about something that Christians get wrong a lot. Now, if you were to think about what does Paul actually say, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, right? And some people, like John Piper, have said, well, no, actually the love of money is the root of all evil. John Piper has made that argument. And it's odd because it's sort of a cliche at this point that pastors will point out the verse actually says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Not money is the root of all evil or something like that. You have to be a little nuanced to recognize the difference in those two ideas. And I disagree with Piper. Piper has said that the love of money is the root of all evil, but he does it by generously expanding the concept of the love of money to include basically the love of anything. The love of life, the love of prosperity, the love of having recognition from your fellow men, the love of comfort. Now, if money stands for all those things, well, sure, the love of value is the root of the love of anything that's evil. You couldn't love evil things unless you had values. That's such a trivial point. Yes, taking something as a value incorrectly is the root of all evil. Okay, but then you haven't really said anything about money or its nature. I agree with the conventional understanding of this passage. It is true that the love of money for its own sake or for the sake of power or whatever, that love of money can be the root of all kinds of evil. True. Nevertheless, what Rand says about this attempts to take the Christian perspective on it and challenge it. So let's look at what she says. This is a Peikoff. The love of money, more aptly, is described as the root of all good. Now, in some sense, is that true? As I've just characterized, the love of money stands for the love of comfort and expanding your range of activity. It stands for human progress. And so, yeah, in some sense, the love of money is the love of all material good. Not all good, unless you just want to be super generous with how you're conceptualizing things. But yeah, the love of money is tied to your love of value as such. So this is from Francisco. He says, money is a tool of exchange. This is in Atlas Shrugged. Money is a tool of exchange which can't exist unless there are goods produced and men able to produce them. Such a tool presupposes everything on which goods and their exchange depend. America is a country of money. Philosophically, this means that it is a country of reason, justice, freedom, production, achievement. I agree with what they're saying here. Look in the middle of this page. They talk about the so-called Protestant work ethic. Peikoff writes that this so-called Protestant ethic taught our forefathers that riches are a sign of virtue, a prize to the diligent conferred by the justice of God. Well, yes, it is true that riches in a free country are a sign of virtue. The agent of justice, however, is not an otherworldly overseer, but a worldly creation, not a supernatural entry, but an objective social system. Well, God created the world in such a way that there could be this social system, so I don't see an incompatibility with Christianity and these points. Money itself must be a freely chosen material, a commodity such as gold, which is an objective equivalent of wealth. Under capitalism, money is not a worthless paper, arbitrarily decreed to be legal tender by men in positions of political power. I agree with Peikoff and Rand that probably the basis for a monetary system in a free economy would be silver, gold, some other precious material that doesn't perish and it can be easily divided, and there's a high demand for it and that it's rare. Those are the kinds of things that you would look for in money. Peikoff writes, under capitalism, critics complain that the rich man has too much power. They say money talks, as if that's a problem. He's just going to kill that objection. He's going to say, yes, it does, but when it doesn't, something else does. Take your pick. It's either political power or money is going to be talking. So he says, when money ceases to be the tool by which men deal with one another, then men become the tools of men. Blood, whips, and guns, or dollars. Take your choice. A quote from Francisco. Many of these objections that you see against free market capitalism are just thoughtless objections, and so we can take them and then shoot them down just that quick. Move to the next section. He says, this brings us to the difference between economic power and political power. This is one of the concerns that the opponents of capitalism have always had, is give people economic power and they'll oppress other people. If we were to look at what the Bible says about oppression, when do we see in the Bible that somebody becoming extra wealthy is in itself oppressive against somebody else. Have we ever seen that? No, I mean, we've seen God promises Abraham great wealth. He promises Solomon great wealth. David becomes wealthy, but he didn't become wealthy by oppressing people. Solomon didn't become wealthy by oppressing people. That's not where their wealth came from. We do see the prophets in the Old Testament condemning different people for oppression, but it's always a case of denying justice, denying them access to stand before the judge and plead their cause. It's about rights. You actually see the word right in Isaiah. The poor have rights, the rich have rights, and we should not be partial. That's the approach that we see in the Bible. This money talks thing, I mean, sure it does. And one of the problems that you see in the Old Testament is that money talks in the sense of you could bribe a judge. So what do you look for in who you choose to be a judge? And that is somebody that hates a bribe. That's all the way from Jethro back in Exodus. He told Moses, you need to appoint people to be judges that hate a bribe and fear God. These are things that are always going to be a challenge in any society that is possible to have bribery. But you have to ask yourself, what conditions lead to bribery being a common feature in a society? One of the features is if you have a government that's capable of making regulations, if you have a government that's capable of making subsidies, tariffs, or any kind of economic favor. That's what leads to a system of bribery. So that's the thing that needs to be removed, because it will always lead to corruption.
The mindset that says that being wealthy automatically means being oppressive is typically based on a very materialistic view of the world, which is ironic because they accuse capitalists of being materialists. What I mean by that is the idea is material wealth is all there is in society. There are no other ways to exert influence. There are no other ways to thrive apart from material wealth. Material wealth is the sum and total of what there is to achieve in society or in your life. And if that's the case, if that really was the case, tied into it is this sort of zero-sum mentality that there's only a certain amount of wealth in the world because it's all just flat material wealth. Wealth doesn't come from the mind, so it can't be generated. So wealth is just a static material quantity. Then yes, it makes sense that you would think that the person who has more of that material wealth is in some way oppressing those who have less, or was involved in some sort of oppression in order to gain that material wealth. All of that assumes materialistic premises about the world that we should be denying as Christians. And most Christians would explicitly deny those materialistic premises, but then they implicitly allow them to function in their worldview in their critiques of capitalism.
It's really well said. So he points out economic power is the power resulting from the possession of wealth. Political power is the power resulting from the government's monopoly on coercion. Economic power, in Rand's words, is exercised by means of a positive, by offering men a reward, an incentive, a payment, a value. Political power is exercised by means of a negative, by the threat of punishment, injury, imprisonment, destruction. So economic power is power, Peikoff writes. In a free society, however, no man's powers, however great, are a hindrance to anyone else. They are a benefit to others. A thought experiment that you can use to see why wealth is a benefit to everybody is just ask yourself, would you rather have exactly what you have right now, but live in a society where most people are more wealthy than you, or where most people only have a little grass hut? What are going to be your opportunities to advance your life if you were to start with what you have right now and live in a society where everybody else has nothing? How much can they contribute to you? How much can they create for you? If you, for instance, were to wash up on a desert island, and there was just nobody else living on the island, or there was a wealthy man living on the island who already had a farm, which island would you rather wash up on? Which one is going to be most likely for you to not die? That's the benefit of other people to you. And Rand will get to that when she starts talking about the pyramid or a hierarchy of ability. And she's going to say, people have always said that the rich are exploiting the poor. It's actually the poor, or those who are less productive, are benefiting more from society than anyone. So we'll get there. Let's go to page 404 in the middle there. Peikoff writes, in a capitalist system, the greater a man's power to think and thereby to satisfy his materialistic greed, in quotes, the greater the benefits he confers on his fellows. And he says, but that's not the justification of the system. But right now we are in the philosophy of economics, so we're asking how things work out. This is the truth. The less a man's power to satisfy his, quote, greed or even his needs, the more he depends on the minds above him. So this is the pyramid of ability. And I'll just read a couple excerpts. This is a quote from Rand. Material products can't be shared. They belong to some ultimate consumer. It is only the value of an idea that can be shared with an unlimited number of men, making all sharers richer at no one's sacrifice or loss, raising the productive capacity of whatever labor they perform. It is the value of his own time that the strong of the intellect transfers to the weak, letting them work on the jobs he discovered while devoting his time to further discoveries. This is mutual trade to mutual advantage. The interests of the mind are one, no matter what the degree of intelligence among men who desire to work and don't seek or expect the unearned. In proportion to the mental energy he spent, the man who creates a new invention receives but a small percentage of his value in terms of material payment, no matter what fortune he makes, no matter what millions he earns. But the man who works as a janitor in the factory producing that invention receives an enormous payment in proportion to the mental effort that his job requires of him. I agree with all these points. We're in the middle of 405 now from Peikoff. When the strong are left free to function, everyone benefits. When the strong are enslaved or regulated, everyone is doomed. So that's their understanding of this concept of the pyramid of ability. It's totally different from what we see from most people, most thinkers today, and so therefore it's different from what most people within the church would understand. Peikoff is going to have a section here where he mentions that the people that have defended capitalism have sometimes done a very bad job. So, for example, he discusses this case of Herbert Spencer. From the mid-1800s, there was a fad of Darwinianism, and so he tried to argue for capitalism on the basis of Darwinian theory, which is philosophically not the reason why capitalism is good or effective or how it works, because we do not live in a dog-eat-dog world or anything like that. That's just not the way human society works. Peikoff writes, the wrong arguments for a position are always more costly than plain silence, which at least allows a better voice to be heard if he should ever speak out. So Peikoff actually, he says that Spencer probably did more harm to capitalism than Marx did. And I would agree with that. We don't have to be Spencerian in our advocacy. We don't have to be Nietzschean. Peikoff writes, there is no clash in a free society among any groups who choose life as their standard. When men's rights are respected, all men are equal before the law and therefore equal before nature and equal before the marketplace. He writes, under capitalism, men enjoy equality of opportunity. In the only legitimate sense of that vague, usually statist term, each has the right to act on his mind's conclusions and to keep its products. Compare his vision to this Darwinian one. The Darwinian one actually resembles the ethnic identitarians that we see today, whether that would be the white ones or the black ones, or any. I mean, I've seen many people saying that my group is the good group, my skin color group is the good group. Those people do believe that there is a clash in a society among groups, but the clash will be between those who choose life as their standard and those who choose something else as their standard. That's the kind of clash that you're really going to have. Okay, go to the top of page 406. Peikoff writes, the ultimate validation of capitalism is it institutionalizes not only right values and virtues, but also the deepest truths. So his validation for capitalism is not it leads to wealth, it's that it institutionalizes virtuous living. And it institutionalizes living that is based on truth, based on reality orientation. So what does he mean by that? Well, it's the system of recognizing reality. That's his justification for it. You're in a disagreement with somebody and they say, well, how do you really justify capitalism? Don't start by saying, because it leads to wealth. The conservatives grant that. Even the liberals grant that. How do you justify capitalism? It's the system that recognizes reality and that lets people live in a moral way. That's the reason why capitalism is right. And specifically through the concept of recognizing individual rights. That's what makes it different from the other systems. Go ahead, Jacob.
I was actually just going to add that I wanted to point out how important it is, at least in today's context, to emphasize that the primary justification is that capitalism recognizes the reality of man's inalienable rights. Because you could say capitalism recognizes the realities of and institutionalizes certain virtues, and many tradcons would agree with that goal. They would just disagree on which virtues ought to be institutionalized. And they would say, yes, we need the economy to be managed in such a way that we institutionalize certain virtues. And here's the list of traditional Christian virtues that we want to institutionalize through the economy. And then on the flip side, the social justice warriors would say, yes, we want the economy to recognize the realities of human need. And here's what we mean by that. To make it explicitly different and unique from those views, which would agree on those goals as stated, I think it's important to explicitly say the reality of man's inalienable individual rights.
So there is this meme that I saw the other day where this guy was reading Ayn Rand. I think he was reading Atlas Shrugged. The book says, A is A. And then the guy's like, capitalism is dope. From A is A to capitalism is good. That's the entire argument of objectivism. And so the meme was making a joke about how objectivists, they're like, well, of course capitalism is good because A is A. That's actually what we think, but that doesn't give much substance to the view. But that is in outline what we actually think. It's a parody, but it's accurate. Let's put it into more philosophical terms. Peikoff says, whoever understands capitalism sees it as the social system flowing from the axiom that existence exists. So if existence exists, and we need to take that seriously, that leads to certain responsibilities, recognizing certain realities, recognizing one of those realities being individual rights. Implication, capitalism. Yeah, straight line from A is A to capitalism is dope. That's true. In light of all that, Peikoff is now going to analyze the opposing philosophical systems. If it's true that A is A leads to capitalism, then it follows opposition to capitalism is dependent on saying that A is not equal to A. That's the root of all objections to capitalism, is a refusal to recognize that A is A refusal to be reality-oriented. Whenever you see somebody dogging on capitalism, you can diagnose them immediately and you can say, this is not just a deficiency in the understanding of economics. This is a truth deficiency. This is a methodological deficiency. You do not handle truth in a virtuous way. That is the problem. There's a moral issue. Clearly, we've discussed the moral basis of capitalism, but even before that, there is the epistemological one. So Peikoff will summarize both, moral and epistemological. The moral issue is that you cannot combine the ethics of sacrifice with the politics of individualism. Morality is going to teach us what is practical. And Rand says the evaluation of an action as practical depends on whatever it is that you want to practice. Let's say someone wishes to practice power lust, going back to nature, sacrificing the able, sacrificing everybody. Capitalism is not practical. It represents the opposite of all such practices. If you have a good moral code in place, you know capitalism is good. And if you do not know capitalism is good, then you do not have a good moral code in place. This is all the implications of that. But now let's go back even further. Before morality is epistemology. The deepest root of politics is not morality, but its root, epistemology, combined with metaphysics. Truth in regard to social problems as to all others does not force itself on men's mind. Men have to perform a definite cognitive process. And so he writes, the opponents of capitalism, sometimes they are sincerely stupid. I mean, sure, they are unvirtuous by definition. But he says that we must say they are honestly stupid. And it's a self-made, epistemologically induced stupidity. The intellectuals that are opposed to capitalism are deaf to facts. And they come to political conclusions by whim. He gives some illustrations of the pattern. But if you've ever seen the Twitter account of Robert Reich or Paul Krugman or Joe Biden, you'll understand. These people, they're suffering from a self-induced stupidity. It's because they are morally vicious that they have become completely stupid. So to illustrate the pattern, let us consider the Marxist charge, which he already answered earlier, that capitalism leads to coercive monopolies. Now he says, supposing we plunge into this imaginary discussion, we start to answer the opponent by offering a definition of monopoly. But definitions, the modern mentality replies, are a matter of semantics. Or definitions are a matter of authority, and mine is endorsed by 3 Nobel laureates. Or why do we need any single rigid definition? I know what a monopoly is, even if I can't state it in a cut and dried formula. Now, if you've ever engaged on Twitter, you'll know that these are not exaggerations. This is what people will say to you. So the translation of that is we can dispense with definitions, essentials, clarity, objectivity, concepts. All we need are percepts and feelings. Nobody would say it like that, but that is what it means. And that is the essential issue that we've been looking at throughout this whole book. Is that really the way to approach truth? One more silly objection is, that's theory, that's system building, that's ideology, who needs it? One time Jacob made an argument and somebody says, oh, that's just ideological claptrap. This was some professor, maybe at Baylor or some school like that. This is the way that thugs that rule our academic institutions interact with intellectual arguments. They don't even know what it would mean to interact with them. All they can do is say, oh, that's ideological, so therefore it's claptrap. The translation of all of that is we can dispense with abstractions, hierarchy, context, and integration. That's really what they don't like. They don't like integration. He summarizes it, and he says we can dispense with principles. We can dispense with absolutes, causality, knowledge. Nothing is certain but death, taxes, and the evil of capitalism. In other words, these are children. These are people that try to argue with you by whatever words they think can cast a spell on you and control you. It's presuppositionalism at its root. Who can talk to mentalities like these? Peikoff writes, they cannot be convinced by a process of logic because they have no inkling of the nature of such a process. Thanks to the epistemology they practice and probably preach, they are not open to reason. Those are the people that we deal with. That's the world as it is today. Doesn't have to be, but it's a lack of moral vision for the sanctity of the truth. All right, we have a little break in the material, and here's sort of a new section where Peikoff tries to address more objections. So he writes, all the evils widely ascribed to capitalism flow not from capitalism, but from its opposite. This includes such evils as economic depressions, child labor, racism, adulterated food and drugs, pollution, war, and pornography. That's maybe not an expected position from somebody that's associated with libertarian thought, but Peikoff would say that all those things are evils. They come from mixed economies or statist economies. We don't have to go into detail on each one of these points, but we can, if anybody would like to discuss them.
Before we cruise through them, I just wanted to point out that the whole summary that you just went over, ending with who can talk to mentalities like these? They cannot be convinced by a process of logic because they have no inkling of the nature of such a process. That entire section just was shouting to me, Yaron Hazony. And,
oh, yes.
And the neoconservative, national conservative ilk that follow him. As you pointed out, there is no coherent argument. There's just vomiting of emotional rhetoric that is not fact-based, or it cherry-picks certain facts and assumes very, very hidden premises that they'll never state out front in order to make logical leaps to all kinds of unwarranted conclusions. It's atrocious. You can see that when on the few times where Yaron Hazony has debated Yaron Brook on capitalism and related issues. If anybody wants to see the modern day clash of the things that Peikoff's talking about here, look up the various debates that Yaron Brook and Yaron Hazony have had together.
I saw somebody summarize the national conservative argument, and it basically was John Locke happened. After that, there was the French Revolution. And then after that, there was Drag Queen Story Hour. So therefore, capitalism is bad QED. Mumble something about the post-war consensus, the liberal consensus. It's like they're all making their arguments based on just a couple of books that are really pathetic books. Let's discuss economic depression. He says that usually happens because of manipulations of the money supply. Have we ever had an economic depression where it wasn't something to do with the money supply? Child labor, it was necessitated by feudal economies, but child labor was already on a huge decline before it was ever made illegal by the lobbies. He talks about racism as a form of collectivism that's been entrenched worldwide throughout history, except under capitalism. It's easy for us, living in one of the societies that has been most free and most opposed to racism and most capitalist. It's easy for us to say we wish that we had less racism, but compare our society to others. All right, so he talks about adulterated food and drugs. He says they're rare on a free market because a seller's reputation for quality is essential to his long-range profits and because fraud is a crime. He talks about pollution being a minor side effect of industrialization. Only an unfettered industry has the financial and technological means to clean up. You cannot compare apples and oranges. You cannot compare, should we have pollution at all to no pollution? No pollution means no economy. So ask yourself, what are the alternatives that we're choosing from? Are we choosing from having some pollution and an economy? The question of how to address when somebody has polluted in a way that violates individual rights is one that you can see in Rand's other work. There are cases. Clearly, there are cases when somebody pollutes and it damages somebody. There could be a case made for, like we have homeowners associations, there could be an entire geographical area the size of a county that has a certain policy about the air quality. But that would come from a system where people own the land individually and they can contractually come to these policies rather than just by fiat. He talks about war being the product of dictatorships. They survived by looting. The major wars in history were started by the more controlled economies at the time against the freer ones. And he even ascribes the evil of pornography to the hopelessness that comes in a land where liberty is not the norm. In a mixed economy or in a semi-free country, drug addiction likewise, they spread because people are terrified by an unknowable future. I'd agree with him. I mean, you're never going to have a society where nobody uses drugs or nobody looks at porn or is sexually immoral. You tend to see those things increase in times of economic downturn. So there's a cause and effect thing there on aggregate. Contrast Peikoff's approach to that issue, say alcohol, access to alcohol or drugs for kids, access to pornography or access to pornography for kids even. You compare how Peikoff would handle that. Peikoff's view is that there should be laws that make it so that kids can't have access to these things. But you compare that to somebody like Yaron Hazony, and he's going to say things like, basically, we can't have a free market because we need to make a ban against these things. And it's like, well, you haven't really listened to your opponents. because we also think that there should be some forms of bans on these things. It's just a question of in what way. If that's your entire argument for why conservatism is right, it's because we need to have this one policy on this one substance or something, then you're not really thinking about it in a principled way. You're making special pleading. All right, now Peikoff is going to go through a section here where he lists these contradictory, self-canceling falsehoods, and it's a really hilarious section. So I just want to read these. He says, okay, now imagine somebody that at one time is willing to say capitalism is the system of coercive monopolies, but at the same time, it's the system of cutthroat competition. And therefore, it's wrong for both of those reasons. Can you see incoherence there? Is it the system of coercive monopolies, or is it the system of cutthroat competition? It's one or the other. Another person might say capitalism debases men by creating hunger, but then also capitalism subverts morality by creating affluence. I've heard this. A magazine like Salon or The Atlantic, they would publish those statements or statements like them on the same day without blushing. How about this? Capitalist greed causes inflation. Whereas they might also say the gold standard leads to an inadequate supply of money and credit. That's Keynes. Interesting. All right, another one. Capitalism is another name for militaristic imperialism, but such people would also say conscription is necessary because no one would fight even a war of self-defense under a free system. It sounds like Colin Powell. Capitalism is hostile to invention, because they're going to talk about some industrialist that suppressed a new discovery like Thomas Edison or something. And then they're going to say, but capitalism leads to an intolerable rat race of inventions. A couple more of these doozies. Capitalism is fine for the productive genius, but what about the common man? But then the next day they'll say capitalism is fine for the common man, but what about the genius? Because think about how a physicist genius doesn't make as much money as a rock star. Last one. Capitalism is impractical in our complex modern world. We are too advanced. But then the next day they'll write, capitalism is impractical in the underdeveloped world because they're not advanced enough. Special pleading, changing the rules, moving the goalposts. This is not a serious-minded group of people. Some men have the grace to blush, Peikoff writes, when the above pairs are pointed out, but others see no need to even blush. Having rejected every requirement of the conceptual faculty, they don't even hesitate to throw out explicitly its method. So they might say something like, Aristotelian logic is old-fashioned. We use a dynamic, dialectic, or multi-valued approach to thought. It's just hand-waving. That's it. There are many senseless projections that people give about what life would be like under pure capitalism. Like, for example, he says, what if commercial firefighters charged $1 million to put out a fire? He says, this is like asking, what if bakers refuse to let people buy their bread? It's not serious as an objection. Turn the tables on the critic. One rarely hears anybody ask, what if under socialism a clerk in the People's Planning Commission nurses a hatred for some helpless worker? Or what if the top leader turns into a monster? Those are the kinds of questions that the socialists need to answer. He writes, the most ludicrous of all the projections is, what if under capitalism no one volunteers to help the truly helpless? Such callousness never existed in early America. It is possible on a large scale only when men are crushed by poverty thanks to statism, and or when men feel mutual hatred, thanks to being forced to subsist as prisoners in collectivist chain gangs. Peikoff is summarizing the epistemology that leads to all this. He says, their epistemology permits them to manipulate the data as they choose to reach any conclusions they like in regard to any matter of fact, and their ethics programs them to reach only statist conclusions. For proof, just go on Twitter and look up Robert Reich, spelled kind of like the Third Reich. Our intellectuals are literal know-nothings, Peikoff writes, especially in the field of their own specialization. Yes, that's what we're dealing with. An honest but non-philosophical man can recognize rising prosperity in the 19th century America, but he will not know the implications of his observations for today's world. Skip to the next paragraph. An honest man can see the worldwide failure of statism, but without philosophy, he will not know how to answer the people telling him that the failure stems not from the nature of statism, but from its perversion. From the wrong leaders with the wrong tactics, the people who say, our gang would do better. An honest man can see that America is now on the brink of chaos and even suicide, but without philosophy, he cannot identify the opposite principles that we need. And so we're summarizing, this is the end of the chapter now. Peikoff writes, if a man understands only that something is wrong, he is vulnerable to those who clamor that what is wrong is that there is still too much capitalism in the country. Peikoff summarizes his chapter here. He writes, capitalism is practical, capitalism is moral, capitalism is true. But men will never know it until they understand these three concepts: practical, moral, true, along with everything on which they hierarchically depend. If men are ever to reach a world where man is free not by permission, but on principle, they must first enact the cause of freedom. They must grasp and accept the intellectual base it requires. What is that intellectual base? Well, that's everything that we said about epistemology and ethics. And so to summarize, Peikoff writes, the battle for the world is not a battle between two political ideals. It is a battle between two views of the nature of thought. And so we conclude chapter 11 in Peikoff's book here. I would like now to raise any objections, any questions, and also say some things about what he believes in comparison to Scripture, and bring Scripture to bear on this and see if they accord with each other. And this was the last day in our Objectivism book study that we are discussing politics. Next week it's going to be on art. We'll have 2 sessions on that, and then 2 sessions on the theory of history. Hey, go ahead, Greg. Great to see you, man.
I've been thinking about this concept this week with the love of money, because I was thinking about Francisco's speech in Atlas Shrugged. And it occurred to me there's 2 kinds of the love of money that I think are being conflated. On one hand, you have somebody like Hank Rearden who loves to create wealth and loves to create industry. People like Dagny Taggart, Hank Rearden, and even Rockefeller back in the day. But then on the other hand, you have people who are consumed by money. They might be rich people, they might be poor people, but it's people like Lillian Rearden who, they're obsessed with these expensive things. And it's not just that they want nice things, it's that they obsess over them, and that's where they get their value and importance from, is buying this $1,000 tablecloth and a $10,000 set of china. So I just wanted to throw that thought out there. It's one that I'm still fleshing out, but I think it's important to say, hey, there can be different kinds of love for money. It's not necessarily that every kind of love for money is inherently bad. And I'm sure I'd love to hear Jacob's thoughts on that.
Yeah, the virtue is love of making money, love of being productive, of building wealth. That is the virtue. The vice is love of the status or social significance and the results of money, especially divorced from the virtue of making the money. The vice is what Rand calls reversing causation in regard to money. It's the attempt to gain the notoriety of being wealthy apart from the cause of building the wealth yourself.
I was definitely seeing that I was in Miami recently for a while, and I saw that quite a bit, where it seemed like you had people who wanted to have shiny, flashy things and other people who wanted to start businesses and be productive. Really appreciate your thoughts and explanation there.
It raises that topic of conspicuous consumption, the idea of what is your motivation. That's really what we need to be thinking of as we evaluate. There is such thing as crass materialism, showiness. In Scripture, we're to be modest. And so you have to ask yourself, what does modesty look like as a virtue? That will affect your choices about your consumption, won't it? Modesty is contextual. If I were to host a business event, say I were to fly a whole bunch of successful businessmen over to where I live in Orange County, and we were to go do some activity together, modesty would be a whole different thing than if I were to invite somebody out to lunch after church, depending on who they are, depending on what I know about their economic status. You have to use your good judgment, and it's contextual, as all values ought to be. A couple of closing remarks. One objection that I think we need to handle as Christians is this idea of wanting to keep my own property. We know that that's a selfish thing and that it's been rejected because it's selfish, but we know on the basis of the things that we've said in past discussions, selfishness is not always going to be a bad thing. But keeping my own property, how can we understand that from a Christian point of view? What are the reasons why as Christians we should be motivated to fight for our own right to our own property? We know that when God wrote the 10 Commandments, that was not unspiritual. When he wrote, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, there was nothing unspiritual about those commands. Think about how God is pleased when we do follow sound principles for who owns what property. God is pleased when we follow his principles. For example, if we uphold in our society this principle, thou shalt not steal, does that please God? That is a spiritual thing to fight for somebody else's property or for your own rights. That is a spiritual thing. When we do this, when we have a sound approach to economics, it will lead to material prosperity for the most part. Historically, this is true. Logically, it is true. We will prosper more by observing man's right to keep what he produces. That itself is glorifying to God, as we know from the creation mandate, the mandate to dominate the world from the very beginning of Genesis. This is the kind of world that God made for us to do things in. Also, when we preserve individual rights, we know historically that those countries that have observed individual rights have been the missionary sending countries. If you protect the rights of the individual, you are preserving the conditions in which it is most possible to share the gospel. We don't share the gospel by having government welfare programs. We do share the gospel by having people go actually preach it, and people bring material aid to others to some degree as they're preaching the gospel. That's a powerful way of getting people's attention and building trust. My dad used to be a missionary in the jungle in Bolivia, and he would fly the Cessna 6-seater. They'd fly out to the middle of nowhere where there were people that needed dental care or that had health problems, and they would bring a doctor and an evangelist. That's the kind of thing that you have in a free market. That's not the kind of thing that a government program will ever do or will ever do right. Protect free markets for that. Free markets support the development of virtue. What kind of world do you want your children to grow up in? Do you want them to grow up in a world where they have hope? In a world where they believe that they can actually work hard and make something of themselves and have self-worth? That's a free market world we're talking about. So if you believe in the pursuit of values and a moral life, fight for the free market. That creates a world where your children can be value-oriented. At the beginning of the video today, I brought up this question of the limits of government. What should the limits of government be? And I just want to reiterate, I agree with Rand on this, that it should be individual rights. It should be the fundamental question that governments are oriented toward. So the need for the government arises because people fight, because they disagree, because we have to put retaliatory force under control. It's not possible for people to live at peace in a society unless they are dealing with each other by persuasion and consent and agreement. And so the purpose of the government is to outlaw force, to ban the initiation of force. But the government can never be allowed to act as a criminal, because if the government is given that power to use force in a positive way, it becomes much more powerful than any criminal. As you are thinking about what political policies you want to vote for, always ask yourself, are you turning the government into a criminal? Are you putting the government in charge of taking people's tax money with the power of a hold-up man and a gun and a jail cell behind the kinds of things that you're doing? A friend of mine named Sean Edwards pointed out that there's hardly a more important thing that you could think about than this question of what do you want the government to do? Because you are putting a gun at somebody else's head when you make a law. That's a huge responsibility, and we often downplay that or overlook it. If you really do want to champion that there should be a political policy of some kind, ask yourself, are you willing to pull the trigger? Are you willing to send your son out to pull the trigger? Is that really what you believe? Any law has force behind it. And so ask yourself, is it morally right that I and my neighbor gang up together and put a gun to this person's head if they don't do this? That's the mindset that we should have before we make laws. Now, until you understand this principle that that's what law is, and until you're willing to say that the government should only operate on the policy of banning force, upholding individual rights, then you're courting disaster. So at ChristianIntellectual.com, we believe that there is a principle that limits government, and it is the same principle that defines what a government is in the first place. That principle is individual rights, as seen through the issue of force. Keep in mind some of the facts on which this theory is grounded. We know that the initiation of force is incompatible with human flourishing. We know that men should deal with each other by persuasion. We know it's wrong on a personal level to initiate force against other people. We know that if somebody does initiate force, it's proper to retaliate using force sometimes. We know that retaliatory force has to be put under control objectively. And we know, therefore, that there is a need for a government. We know that a government that does more than that single job is necessarily going to be a gangster. It's going to be the greatest threat to mankind. And so we know the principle of sound government. A sound government exists for only one purpose: to protect individual rights. That is the answer. And that is what churches should be preaching. I know, it's a bold statement. That is what Christians should be spreading. And those who stand against this policy, we need to wipe the floor with their reputation. We need to destroy their reputations. Whether they be theonomists, whether they be national conservatives, whether they just be social conservatives that don't have policies, they can't name principles. There needs to be an army of new Christian intellectuals that are going to dominate this space and embarrass everyone else that cannot name these principles. Here's what is at stake. Will we get the Bible right? Will we live in a free society? And will it last? And so I challenge you Christians, for the sake of the future and for the sake of your own pride in yourself, fight as if this issue matters. Be careful about who you ally yourself with, because most people are against God. Even most people in the church on this issue are against God. So we need to be much more careful about how we define what is true and what is false, what is right and wrong. Well, thank you for joining on this discussion. I'm looking forward to the next several weeks as we wrap up the Objectivism book study. Find everything at christianintellectual.com/objectivism. I'll talk to you next time. God bless.